Well, one of the corollaries or results of the anti-philosophical turn in philosophy in the 20th century might have been the turn away from, or at least the turn toward reducing, trivializing, eliminating the concept of truth. So the second in this series of essays that have been published, this one was in Aeon in late 22, early 22, is about sort of the fate of truth in 20th century philosophy. Again, I mean, I guess one thing that's characteristic of all these topics, the way I'm tackling them, is I go across the analytic continental divide. I'm looking for things that are common to those, or ways of narrating the history of 20th century philosophy that would encompass them both. Now, okay, so for this Aeon essay, looking at it, I think like organizing this set of historical excursions, I would take a somewhat different approach, less polemical. In a way, I set up as defending truth from various 20th century, what I think of as critiques, reductions, eliminations of truth, suspicions of truth. I think we need truth. I don't think we're anywhere close to doing without that. One of our absolutely central and essential concepts. Contentful too, I say. Okay, but I'm trying to, instead of, okay, I have my own theory of truth, or at least, structure, a basic set of ideas as expressed in Entanglements, chapter 2 of Entanglements, a system of philosophy. But I'm not concerned with all that so much as narrating the fate of truth in 20th century philosophy across several traditions, including pragmatism in this case a little more seriously. So the headline here was Truth is Real. For a century, again, that emphasizes the polemical flavor of this, like a defense of truth. For a century, that sounds so reactionary, doesn't it? All right. I don't think it is. It depends on what you mean by truth, too. For a century, the idea of truth has been deflated, becoming a terrain from which philosophers fled. They must return, says this subhead, urgently. Edited by Sam Dresser. Appreciate that. This was a good edit, too. It is often said, rather casually, that truth is dissolving, that we live in the post-truth era. But truth is one of our most central concepts, perhaps our most central concept. And I don't think we can do without it. I don't think we're anywhere near doing without it. I think I just said that, didn't I? To believe that this is 22, spring 22. To believe that masks prevent the spread of COVID is to take it to be true that they do, even if that's false. To believe it is to take it to be true. To assert it is to assert it is to claim that it is true. These are definitional of assertion and belief. Truth is plausibly central to thought and communication in every case. And of course, it's often at stake in practical political debates and policy decisions with regard to climate change or vaccines, for example, or who really won the election, or whom we should listen to about what. I guess these are things that seemed urgent in 2022. One might have hoped to turn to philosophy for a clarification of the nature of truth and maybe even a celebration of it. But philosophy of pragmatist, analytic, and continental varieties lurched into the post-truth era a century ago. It's a little too simplistic, provocative. This post-truth era thing is just... anyway. If truth is a problem now for everyone, if the idea seems empty or useless in the era of social media, science denialism, conspiracy theories, and such like, maybe that just means that everyone has caught up to where philosophy was in 1922. Before the 20th century, reflection on truth in the Western intellectual and spiritual traditions usually exalted it. Beauty is truth, truth beauty, That is all you know on earth and all you need to know, declares John Keats very Grecianly, or at least platonically. Plato having anointed truth as the goal of philosophy and the goal of human life. Assuredly, we must be bold to speak what is true, above all when our discourse is upon truth. Aletheia is the Greek term. I guess the study of truth is sometimes referred to as aletheology. We must be bold to speak what is true above all when we're talking about truth. Socrates says in the Phaedrus, it is true that it's there that true being dwells in the truth, without color or shape, that cannot be touched. Reason alone, the soul's pilot, can behold it, and all true knowledge is knowledge thereof. Plato's truth is identical not just with the beautiful, but with the good and the just. It is the highest thing. Jesus agrees, proclaiming himself at John 14:6 to be the way, the truth, and the life. Philosophical reflection has not always treated truth as a god, but it was certainly a central concept, commitment, and question for some 2,500 years. Characteristically, Aristotle is more grounded than his teacher Plato. When he gave the classic, is more grounded than his teacher Plato when he gives the classic formulation of the correspondence theory. This is Aristotle, famously. This is deep as shit, or trivial as shit, fundamental, or fundamentally empty. To say of what is that it is, to say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false. While to say of what is that it is. To say of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not, is to say what is true. That's fairly crisp, if somewhat bewildering. But this definition, like many characterizations of truth, appears oddly redundant, notably uninformative. On the other hand, every formulation seems beset by redundancy, and the terrifying question looms: is your definition of truth true? The correspondence theory has been formulated and reformulated over the centuries. Truth is the agreement between intellect and object, says Thomas Aquinas. The agreement between intellect and object. Explaining agreement by means of near synonyms such as concord or conformity. Immanuel Kant puts it like this: truth is the agreement of cognition with its object. That seems fairly clear until you start pressing, since Kant thinks that empirical facts are produced within the forms of human consciousness. In some sense, for Kant, truth is the agreement of cognition with itself or with its own involuntary constructions, rather than with an external reality. Ludwig Wittgenstein, in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus of 1921, Wittgenstein again, is a central figure here again, as he was in the history of 20th century philosophy, and he's just central. I'm centrally concerned with critiquing Wittgenstein. Gives what in Tractatus gives perhaps the last great statement of the correspondence theory, treating sentences or propositions as pictures. If the elements of the world depicted correspond to the elements of the picture, which accurately represents them in their relations to one another, if the picture matches the fact, then the proposition is true. However, the agreement or matching on which correspondence rests is difficult to explain, famously. Elucidate that. What is it for a sentence to agree with a reality or like a fact? That's some vague ass shit. Or meaningless. Philosophers found that they couldn't themselves agree about what? Sentences, propositions, beliefs, cognitions, pictures, ideas? Was supposed to agree with what? Objects, facts, the world, reality? And then there was the little matter of the agreement itself, which seems to be conceived as producing a simulation or picture of reality in your head or in your language, and trying to assess whether the representation sufficiently resembles things as they really are, apart from all representations. This, as many 20th century philosophers, including Wittgenstein himself, came to note, is evidently impossible. matching up to see whether your sentences match up to a reality. Like, here's the sentence, here's the reality. Do they match? It seems to require us to exit our own consciousness and our own cultures so we can see what things are like outside of any of our representations of them, to see whether our representations match up with them. This is a fundamental Kantian dynamic here. For such reasons, and under the influence of Kantian and Hegelian idealism, the various classical versions of correspondence were challenged by coherence theories, which incidentally re-exalted truth, at least in some of their versions. Underneath these developments was a struggle about what sort of thing reality is as a whole. A series of discrete facts, independent of human consciousness, as the correspondence theory suggests, or a web or network of interdependent facts, leaning on each other and perhaps on human consciousness, only understandable as a whole, as the idealists insisted. Of course, logical coherence does bear on truth. If you believe both horns of a contradiction, for example, you have at least one false belief. You have at least one true belief if you believe both horns of a contradiction. Well, I guess, okay. Falsity can sometimes be corrected in one direction or the other by pointing out that what someone is saying now is incompatible with what they said before. The British idealist F.H. Bradley formulated the view like this in 1914. The general view, which others and myself may be said to have inherited from Hegel, is this: that the criterion of truth lies in the idea of system. An idea is true theoretically because, and so far as, it takes place in and contributes to the organism of knowledge. And on the other hand, an idea is false of which the opposite holds good. To get the ultimate truth, that's the end of the quote. To get to the ultimate truth from Bradley, to get the ultimate truth, we would need to see how the particular claim fits into something like a complete theory or system of the universe as a whole. Each fact is a fact, and is the fact it is, only in relation to such a system. We cannot assume, wrote Harold Joachim, it's not like Joachim, I don't think, Joachim in 1906, fairly well-known philosopher in his day, Joachim, Joachim, in 1906, should try to look that up, that the idea in question possesses we cannot assume, wrote Harold Joachim, that the idea in question possesses its significance, its fullness of meaning, or its power to constitute truth alone and in its own right. It in turn derives its significance from a larger significant system to which it contributes. And at that level of generality, this is very plausible. Any particular proposition or any particular sentence does not stand there matching or failing to match. Like, first of all, you got to figure out what each word means in that sentence, for example, which will ramify out into a bunch of other material. Replying to Joachim explicitly, that Joachim was the whipping boy for Russell on coherence. Bertrand Russell considered the conspicuously false claim, Bishop Stubbs was hanged for murder. Bishop Stubbs was hanged for murder. Now let's suppose Bishop Stubbs was a saint, and his alleged hanging completely incompatible with most of what is known of him. However, the belief that he was hanged for murder might happily keep company in a distorted anti-clerical belief system with such propositions as most bishops are violent criminals. This is not me. This is Russell. Most bishops are violent criminals. Now, you might think that he's being anti-Catholic, but I think, they're Anglican bishops too, right? This is who he really has in mind, I bet. Most bishops are violent criminals, or bishops are generally hanged. And for that matter, consider the case in which Bishop Stubbs actually turned out to be guilty of murder, which does not at all cohere with what we thought about him. This is me now. It might be true for all that, disturbingly enough. Now, the overwhelming objection to the coherence theory, in short, is that there might be two or more equally coherent theories or belief systems that contradict one another, in which case the coherence in which case coherence seems to drive us to describe two or many flatly incompatible beliefs, such as vaccines work and the vaccines don't work. These particular vaccines work and these particular vaccines don't. The same. As true if each appears an element in a sufficiently coherent system. And perhaps they do, as each functions in its own information bubble. Indeed, it might have been a certain commitment to the coherence view that drove Hegel to abandon, or at least qualify, the principle of non-contradiction, the claim that if a sentence is true, it's not also false. At that point, however, coherence is getting pretty incoherent. And to have any truth at all, we might have to wait, with Hegel, for the synthesis of all knowledge and history into a single final account. That definitely seems to be entailed by the various formulations here. Truth really is the final system. I mean, Peirce is down that road too a little bit. By the early 20th century, I mean, the final system, whatever that is, with ultimate hang-together coherence, making truth like this, ideal limit condition that we can only approach. By the early 20th century, these views seemed to many philosophers, coherence and correspondence, to introduce more obscurities than were there to begin with in the notion of truth. In an academy in which the sciences and mathematics were in a period of relatively clear and useful results, and in which most scientists and mathematicians were operating quite well without a grand metaphysical theory of truth, the millennia-long history of reflection on this topic came to seem something of an embarrassment. So this is the same moment of history, early 20th century, I was talking about before. We're turning against the idealist tradition with its grand metaphysical mumbo-jumbo. And that, moves us either to talk about truth in a completely different way, or just to drop it, and to give motivations for dropping it, let's say. The first real pinprick to the truth blimp was inflicted by American pragmatism, devised by C.S. Peirce around 1880. Actually, I think I said that before, 1868, on consequences of four incapacities. Some consequences of four incapacities, which is states pragmatism, 20th century pragmatism in 1868 fully. But anyway, what I wrote was devised by C.S. Peirce around 1880 to bring philosophy up to speed with empirical science. Pragmatism demanded truths that could conceivably make a difference to someone, and a theory of truth that shows what we practically mean when we say something is true. The philosopher William James, in his lecture What Pragmatism Means, of 1906, called for a theory that gives us a sense of truth's cash value. Very characteristic pragmatist locution. What's the cash value, man? Sounds pretty American, too. They thought it was fun to sound American. Or as John Dewey put it in Reconstruction in Philosophy, 1920, if ideas, meanings, conceptions, notions, theories, systems are instrumental to an active reorganization of the given environment, to a removal of some specific trouble and perplexity, then the test of their validity and value lies in accomplishing this work as instruments to an active reorganization of the given environment. If they succeed in their office, they are reliable, sound, valid, good, true. All those might be interchangeable terms, or at least frequently. If they increase confusion, uncertainty, and evil when they are acted upon, then they are false. Confirmation, corroboration, verification lie in works, consequences. Handsome is that handsome does. This is also a very central statement of pragmatism, though, or of a certain kind of sort of heavily instrumentalist pragmatism. That which guides us truly is true. Demonstrated capacity for such guidance is precisely what is meant by truth. I'm saying that that's a kind of initial deflationary move. What we mean by true is it just works practically for us, okay? Now that's a way of saying, like, get rid of this mumbo jumbo, and even questions about whether it's a matter of coherence or correspondence, things like that. It's like, does it work? All right. A belief or theory is true for the pragmatist to the extent that it practically helps us solve our problems or allows us to usefully continue our research. That's what we mean when we say it's true that the vaccines are effective. There's no practical purpose to be served by a metaphysical theory or gnomic formula beset by obscurity and circularity. Pragmatism, wrote Richard Rorty in 1982. Keep realizing how central Rorty is in my head all the time. I might be better off with less. Says that truth is not the sort of thing one should expect to have a philosophically interesting theory about. And he took that to be a statement, a corollary of pragmatism. Truth is not the sort of thing one should expect to have a philosophically interesting theory about. Well, that'd be too bad, because that really is one of the most traditional philosophical questions. Of course. The worst, though, the hardest. The post-truth era in philosophy was properly inaugurated in short order after Dewey's and Russell's pronouncements when, in 1927, Frank Ramsey flatly declared the whole notion of truth to be redundant, to convey no content or information. And he's working with Wittgenstein on this, right? Or, I mean, he's working independently. This is a brilliant series of thoughts. But it's a eliminative approach to truth. Like, truth is, it's a redundant concept. It's quite that it's meaningless. It says dispensable. And since it's mysterious, let's dispense. It's apparently mysterious. Actually, it's not mysterious, because we can get rid of it. And then, anyway, okay. There is really no separate problem of truth, but merely a linguistic muddle, wrote F.P. Ramsey. It's true that Caesar was murdered means no more than that Caesar was murdered. And it is false that Caesar was murdered means that Caesar was not murdered. Ramsey conceded that to say that's true might express emphasis or agreement, but it has no content apart from the sentence it emphasizes. Truth, he added, is a superfluous addition. That's a direct attack on the concept, right? Much of the analytic reflection on the truth that followed let the air out one way or another. Philosophers formulated deflationary theories, or simply declared the whole question useless nonsense. The project shifted from grandly characterizing truth in a crisp aphorism to making observations about the concept that could conceivably have a bearing on logic or science. Alfred Tarski's T-schema, probably the most famous work on truth in the 20th century, especially on the analytic side. Although it's just nice. Door just blew shut. Alfred Tarski's T-schema, first put forward in 1933, gives a procedure for saying, well, that was Tarski slamming the door, baby, on truth once and for all. Kaboom. Gives a procedure for saying what makes each true sentence true, rather than providing a crisp definition. The resulting formula appears circular or redundant, just what we'd expect from Ramsey's claim that truth is superfluous. The sentence "snow is white" is true if and only if snow is white. The sentence "snow is white" is true if and only if snow is white. That's the most famous sentence about truth in the 20th century. The sentence "snow is white" is true if and only if snow is white, Tarski points out, and you could then begin to enumerate the truth conditions of every declarative sentence, or any sentence that makes a positive claim, by, as it were, disquoting it, just removing it from the quotation marks, so that it seemed to be about the world rather than about words. The sentence "snow is white," quotation marks are used to mark the fact that the expression as a whole, with the quotation marks, refers to the sentence "snow is white," rather than the whiteness of snow. The sentence "snow is white," quote, is true if and only if snow is white, disquoted, with the quotes removed. That is, if and only if the stuff snow actually has the color white, has the property of being white. Man, I don't know. That would take me a whole lecture to try to get that clear. But on the other hand, if you study philosophy, you probably hit that one pretty hard somewhere. If you're analytic, I don't know if they still hit that one hard. Okay. For that matter, the sentence "snow is chartreuse" is true if and only if snow is chartreuse. Though Tarski's T-schema was presented as an interpretation of the role of truth in logic and mathematics, it's all we can really say about the meaning of truth, even in ordinary language, if Ramsey is right. That is more or less the position that came to be called deflationism. Tarski's approach gives a recursive definition, a procedure for generating the correct application of the concept, rather than straightforwardly telling us what it means, what truth means, what true means. But it is also, in its own way, an attempt to say what true means, whatever the sentence it's embedded in means, without it. By 1996, Donald Davidson, in The Folly of Trying to Define Truth, was describing the by then vast Ramsey-Tarski deflationist history, to which he had centrally contributed, Davidson, as the attempt to eliminate truth. That's the way Davidson himself saw what they were doing, or at least the one tendency post-Tarski. Eliminativist approach to truth. I can do it, man. He also issued a somewhat vague plea to revive the concept of truth, Davidson did, to try to show what role it plays in everyday human communication. Maybe he was hinting that, though the election was stolen, is indeed true if and only if the election was stolen. That's not going to help us conduct a democracy. On the continental side of the great disciplinary divide, philosophers were somewhat longer in getting suspicious of truth as a general notion. Martin Heidegger's wild and difficult treatment in On the Essence of Truth, which is also, I say, one of the best treatments of the concept ever written, 1930, despite his own distrust of metaphysics, was perhaps the last great outbreak of Hegelian-style speculation on this topic. Heidegger starts by demanding to know what must be the case about the world and human beings if correspondence is to be possible. Correspondence of, sentence and world, cognition and object. Consider an ordinary statement about a coin, for example, and what it would mean for it to match up with the coin itself. The coin is made of metal, he points out, sensibly enough. If you thought Heidegger was always obscure, this is a good counterexample. The coin is made of metal, he points out sensibly enough. The statement is not material at all. The coin is round. The statement has nothing at all spatial about it. Let's say, whatever it is, it's not round. I wouldn't say it has nothing spatial about it, but, it depends on what your metaphysics is. With the coin, something can be purchased. The statement about it is never a means of payment. How can what is completely dissimilar, the statement, correspond to the coin? It would have to become the coin, and in that way relinquish itself completely. Heidegger's approach was not to abandon the question of truth, but to retreat to the essence of truth, the conditions that make it possible for statements to correspond to reality. He heads back to truth, we might say, with a capital T, and does this in terms of such notions as the unconcealment of beings, and the idea of the essence of truth as a certain kind of comportment, a psychological or cultural condition of openness in which things come to appear, and thus to underpin ordinary true claims. His attack on correspondence is quick, compelling, and familiar. James's was similar, and Joachim's too. But the subsequent move to truth's essence, despite what I think of it as its real air of profundity, confirm the worst suspicions of the pragmatists. Certainly, in terms of truth's role in mathematics, for example, such concepts as comportment and unconcealment are at best irrelevant. If you're asking me why 2 plus 2, how I know 2 plus 2 equals 4, or what makes that true, and my answer is it has to do with the unconcealment of being, a space of unconcealment of being opening within. Due to your comportment, I'd be like, well, yeah. If the I guess I do that a lot, I should do this like low, exciting and new. If the analytic philosophers were skeptical on conceptual grounds, the critiques that came in the continental waves that followed Heidegger were political, concerning above all the intertwinement of truth and power, a theme directly from Friedrich Nietzsche. What their critique had in common with the analytic material, aside from the suspicion that truth can't or shouldn't be theorized, was a relentless centralization on language, which is the topic of the third of these essays. Both turned from the meaning of truth, as it were, to the meaning of truth. And then they deflated that meaning. Michel Foucault begins one of his reflections like this: truth is a thing of this world. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint. Each society has its own regime of truth, its general politics of truth. That is, the types of discourse which it accepts and makes function as true. The mechanisms and instances which enable one to distinguish true and false statements, the means by which each is sanctioned, the techniques and procedures accorded value in the acquisition of truth, the status of those who are charged with saying what counts as true. Truth and power, in short. Truth is a thing of this world, and the connection of truth and power. These were points made by Dewey. Yeah, they were. But the pragmatists affirmed them as appropriate, connecting truth directly with the prestige of science, the development of technology, and structures of expertise operating for the common good. Foucault was far less sanguine. He foresaw, we might say, the uses to which the Chinese state puts truth about its users, or about its citizens, or what Facebook knows about its users, and what it does with that information. If Anglo-American philosophers kept trying to deflate truth even well after there was no air in it, the Continentals undermined it, then undermined their undermining of it, and then undermined even that. One place this fetches up is in the hyper-real of Jean Baudrillard. So much of our lives has come to be lived through simulations, representations, media, he said in the 1980s. The distinction between representation and reality, or statements and facts, can no longer be maintained. You might say the same about the situationists, for example, Dewey and so on. And if he and Rorty thought so, Baudrillard and Rorty thought so in 1982, they'd be sure of it now as they quested forth on Instagram. No more mirror of being and appearances, of the real and its concept, wrote Baudrillard in the precession of Simulacra. The precession of Simulacra, a classic. By crossing into a space whose curvature is no longer that of the real, nor that of truth, the era of simulation is inaugurated by the liquidation of all referentials. The 1991 Gulf War, Baudrillard asserted, was a made-for-television representation of a war, and, as he claimed in the title of one of his books, the Gulf War never happened. It did not take place. With that, continental philosophy, too, entered the post-truth era. Taken together, the continental and analytic meltdowns indicate that truth is either an evil authoritarian force or that it is nothing at all. That just about does it, don't it? That just about does it, don't it? That's Vern Gosling. I shouldn't say that. That'll just about kill it, won't it? In one way or the other, then, and through the whole century, truth seemed to be in collapse, a scene of puzzlement and despair, a land from which philosophers had emigrated. But we haven't stopped needing to figure out what's true, or stopped arguing about it as though we know what we mean. Questions when we talk about truth. which is not to say it doesn't entail that we do know what we mean. I think we know more about what we mean than some of these folks think we do. Questions about what is true are, putting it mildly, no less urgent now than they were in 1900. Truth, that is, has proven as hard to eradicate as it is to elucidate. We keep finding we need the notion, and certainly it does have practical value, even among all the contestation. Do mRNA vaccines work? What should be done about the climate crisis? Did Joe Biden win the 2020 election fairly? That truth is fabricated, or is a simulation in which the real disappears, or that it is not a property of statements or theories at all and is a dispensable redundancy. The talk of truth is always corrupt. These views have difficulties here and contribute in their small way to the continuing real disaster. I don't think, despite all the attacks on the notion by all sorts of philosophers for a good century, that we're going to be able to do without truth. In a way, I don't think all those attacks touch truth at all, which we're finding is necessary, still the only possible cure. It's puzzling that Ramsey and the deflationists think that the fact that the idea of truth is presupposed in every belief or assertion shows it to be trivial or dispensable. So here's my quick critique of Ramsey, say, and also, or Tarski considered as an overall theory of truth. Ramsey showed, if anything, that truth is central. There's no believing anything without presupposing it. If it's meaningless, so are all beliefs and claims. It goes without saying because it's everywhere. And if claims to have or embody or represent the truth are often impositions of power, as Foucault rightly points out, they are also often manifestations of resistance. Oppressed groups, for example, are liable to have to fight for central truths of their identities and experiences. None of this is confined to the sheer realm of simulacra. As Foucault might have ended up saying, it's about bodies negotiating a physical world together. As a first step to recovering the question, we might broaden the focus from the philosophical question of what makes a sentence or proposition true or false to focus on some of the rich ways that the concept of truth functions in our discourse. That love is true does not mean that it is a representation that matches up to reality. This is material from Entanglements, my book. It does not mean that love hangs together with all the rest of the lover or lovee's belief system. It doesn't mean that the hypothesis that my love is true helps us resolve our problems. It might introduce more problems. It means that the love is intense and authentic, or as I like to put it, that it is actual, real. That my aim is true does not indicate that my aim accurately pictures the external world, but that it thumps the actual world right there in the center, as it were. Perhaps what is true and false isn't only, or even primarily, propositions, but loves and aims and the world itself. That is, I would like to start out by thinking of true as a semi-synonym of real. If I were formulating in parallel to Aristotle, I might say that what is true. It's my theory of truth, I guess. What is true. And perhaps there's something to be said for Heidegger's comportment, after all. To know and speak the real requires a certain sort of commitment, a commitment to face reality. Failures of truth are, often at least, failures to face up. Now, I'm not sure how much that will help with mathematics, but maths needs to understand that it is only one among the many forms of human knowledge. We, or at any rate I, might hope that an account that addresses the traditional questions about propositional truth might emerge from this broader structure of understanding. This is speculative, I admit, but not so speculative that I haven't written 100 pages about it, though. Truth may not be the eternal, unchanging form that Plato thought it was, but that doesn't mean it can be destroyed by a few malevolent politicians, tech moguls, or linguistic philosophers, though the tech moguls and some of the philosophers, David Chalmers, for instance, might be trying to undermine or invent reality itself as well. Until they manage it, the question of truth is as urgent or more urgent than ever, And I would say that despite the difficulties, philosophers need to take another crack. Perhaps not at aletheia as a joy forever, but at truth as we find and need it now. All right, so the next one is on the amazing convergence, again, totally taught to me by Rorty, of on linguistic questions of the analytic and continental traditions in 20th century philosophy. That's number 2, which was a long one.